This is Justice Worriers, a podcast where we think about things that are right and wrong in our world and how Christian ideas can help us respond to them. We prefer hard questions over easy answers, and we'd love you to join us in our ramblings. Listen in and contact us using the links in the show notes. Hello and welcome to Justice Warriors episode 7. My name's Andy and I'm joined by Leah. Say hi, Leah.
Hi there.
And Jörg. Say hi, Jörg.
Hello.
Hi. And this evening's episode is entitled Resist. It's part of a 3-part series. It's the last one. So the series is called What Does Christian Justice Look Like? And the other two were Speak Out and Help People, and this one is Resist, and that's our attempt at coming up with like the areas of the different parts of what like a behaving justly or behaving in a way that's good for a good society might look like. Obviously probably doesn't cover everything, but yeah, today we're talking about resist, by which we mean kind of standing up to the forces of oppression or something like that. So we'll probably get into exactly what we mean by resist and whether it's a good word for it, but that's the general topic for this evening. But before we start, we have to talk about our homework, and the homework that we set ourselves this week was break a rule. Very simple, just break a rule. And Jörg, I think you said you have broken a rule.
I have, and I've broken a rule in the I'm so proud of how I've broken a rule. I went and visited my neighbor because she needed our help. So we have a new neighbor next door, a single mother with a young child, and she came. Well, we've been sort of giving her some gardening tools and things like that as well, but she needed some help with her phone, and I did. So I broke all COVID rules, and for good cause. So now that my reward in heaven is gone, I might as well gloat in this channel about it.
Okay. Right. Well, I wonder how many deaths you'll be responsible for. Fortunately, you'll never know. Leah, what about you? Did you do your homework?
I think I'm just breaking my own rules this week. So I've had 2 rules on lockdown for myself. One was not to spend too much time getting angry on Twitter, and the other was to not get fat. And I have definitely spent too much time just finding things that are critical of what's going on and kind of taking too much outrage and joy from reading those. You know, when something's wrong, when someone says that there might be a vaccine found in September and you go, oh, then the government will get to look like it's all gone well. You're like, no, that's terrible. If a vaccine's found in September, that's just brilliant news, no matter which government gets to claim credit for it. So yeah, and I probably have had a swift slide from my Lent giving up of sugar and eating too much chocolate.
So the challenge was break a rule, but we've just using it as a confession slot.
Yeah, exactly.
So I had a good thought for the last 5 minutes about whether I've broken any rules, and I just don't think I have. I've failed either consciously or unconsciously to do my homework. I think that says something about me.
You've broken the homework rule. That's what you've done.
But I think that's because you quite like the system that we're in, don't you? As you've said before, if someone says, be locked down, you're quite happy to hide yourself away. So there's nothing for you to fight against. It's all. Yeah,
the only problem I have with the world at the moment is I'm required to have a huge amount of social contact with other people. Other than that, it's fine.
And your camera's always working. You can't just say, oh, somehow it's not connecting today.
Yeah. Cool. So yeah, I apologise. I failed to do my homework, and what I should have done is remember that we had homework and actually tried to do it. But I didn't do that.
And that's your confession.
Yeah. So how we normally start a topic is we talk about what are our worries. What is it that makes us worry or gives us crises about this topic? So this is quite easy for me, so I thought I'd start. My worries about when I start talking about resistance and standing up against oppression, my worry is that it makes clear to me how much of a complete failure I am to stand up for any of my principles. Because I'm not doing anything that could be called resisting or fighting oppression or oppressive systems. Earlier, Leah asked me what would make me feel like I was doing that, and I said standing in front of a tank.
That is quite a high bar to be setting yourself from kind of 0 to standing in front of a tank. Is it? Is there not somewhere in between that you might?
Yeah. Well, I mean, turning up for a protest.
Have you ever been on a protest of any description whatsoever?
I think so.
Okay. You don't remember what it was for? Wasn't
I definitely feel like I should have gone on
Coders
more.
United or something. Or
I definitely feel like I should have gone on more.
Well, you can practice in front of a tank in a museum as well, just for starters.
So, Leah, do you have worries about the topic of resist?
My worry is that I feel I've done a fair amount of protesting and kind of dipped my toe in the water with Extinction Rebellion and kind of got close to being part of some of that and been on quite a number of marches, and that I'm not really sure if I know what effective resistance looks like. So it's all very well to say that you've turned up and you've tried to do something, but I'm not sure exactly whether that achieved what it was meant to achieve, or one of the most encouraging things I ever did was be part of the Jubilee 2000 kind of movement, which was a movement just kind of before the millennium to get large amounts of the debt owed by developing world countries written off. And I guess that was great because it gained a lot of traction within churches compared with most of the things I've ever protested about, which was really encouraging, and it was definitely rooted in biblical principles, and there were some Christians kind of very much behind it right from its inception, and it ended up with support from the G7 or G8, I forget, whatever they were at that time, and by no means was all the debt written off, but a decent portion of it was. It's now being run up again and is mainly owed to China, but that's a different story. But at the time, it was a positive thing, and it was something that the church was very much seen to be part of, and something positive that you could say about the church's role in the world. So.
And it felt quite radical and against the system. I think later on I sort of heard stories of how it wasn't quite as radical as we might have thought at the time, in that the debt was never going to get paid back anyway, so people weren't so bothered about cancelling it. But it felt countercultural, didn't it?
Yeah, and there's a difference between actually writing it off and saying that it probably in reality will never be paid back, because it
still traded for political favour.
It was still exactly. It was still being used as a lever over a lot of these countries while it was still out existing. So,
right. And you actually touched in what you're saying there. You touched on a worry that you mentioned earlier, which is that maybe the church isn't. The history of the church isn't a really strong picture of like standing up against oppression and picking up these ideas.
Yeah, I mean, it may be two things. It may be my lack of knowledge, and it might also be that a lot of these things would maybe go under the radar, and we'll never know about the actual truth of how much resistance Christians have put in through the ages, if you like. But it just feels like we can think of obvious examples of Christians campaigning and Christians doing business in a just manner, but I can't think of lots and lots of examples of Christians, kind of Christian resistance movements, if you like. But yeah, as I say, maybe it's my lack of knowledge, but it doesn't feel like it. Other than we talked before about Christian martyrs and people who were killed for their faith. I guess I'm looking for something a little bit wider in terms of people trying to affect societal change. Although, having just said all that, it does ring a vague bell about the Methodists. I'm sure I remember reading some stuff about some of the broad kind of society reforming aims of the Methodists, so maybe that's something I need to go and look into and check out.
Depends on where we're talking. I'm a PhD student working on Methodists in America. It doesn't all look that pretty when you come to slavery all of a sudden. It's
something about the initial...
Because they were not really political. Yeah.
So, Jörg, do you have worries to bring to this discussion?
Yeah, well, all of the above, first of all. I mean, there is always a sense of not doing enough in resistance, and also the question of what is more effective resistance. But then there's another sense in which resistance is also terribly hard because it's so easily co-opted and for other gains, it slides. I mean, at the risk of sounding like a one-trick pony, but from my own life, what I often fall back on for these kind of things is the peaceful revolution in Leipzig, my hometown, against sort of East German rulers. And it was a very short, precious moment of these demonstrations. And weeks later, it was all full of Nazis. Like, it was just incredible how all of a sudden this 1 week you could be there and you have like half the city in this demonstration. And it feels like we're all pulling in the same direction. And 1 or 2 weeks later, it's everybody arguing, and the whole thing seems to be falling over.
Wow, that is amazing.
It's really, really complicated. Yeah,
not amazing in a good way, but yeah.
Yeah, but it's. I think for our topic, it's important because there's always. We are so used to having heroes of resistance and sort of to heroicize resistance, but it's a very tiny, precious moment when this works, and then power slips in, and you're the one on top, or it falls apart and there's infighting. So the kind of unity and the kind of sense this is for good cause is so easily lost. And I think if I think about my main worry about resistance is that.
You justify those that die by wearing the badge, they're the chosen whites. Those who died are justified for wearing the badge, they're the chosen whites. You justify those that died, they're the chosen whites.
So are there people in the Bible that we think of when we think of resisting?
I think Jesus' teaching talks about resistance, but not in very obvious ways, as we've talked about before, really.
So what kind of thing?
Well, I love a story that I've heard, and I hope it's true because it's so compelling. It feels like it's almost too good to be true. You know the bit in the Bible where Jesus says, "If someone strikes you on one cheek, turn the other cheek." Mm-hmm. Well, it doesn't actually say turn the other cheek. It says turn the right cheek. I've got to get this right. If you're standing opposite somebody, i.e. a soldier standing opposite somebody who was just kind of a peasant of the land, then they would never have struck them with their left hand. They would always have struck with their right, because that would have been cultural. So if you're striking somebody that is standing opposite with your right hand, and the first cheek you hit is the left, that means you've backhanded them. So I'm kind of waving my hands around, but of course you can't see that. But it basically means if you're standing opposite somebody, then you've struck them a blow, not a fight as an equal, but a fight as an overlord over a subjugant. Okay, so if you then tell someone to turn the right cheek, it's basically saying, okay, now hit me properly like a man. Does that follow?
Not really.
No. Is it nonsense? I like it.
It doesn't work with the context.
Doesn't it?
And if you compare the versions between Luke and Matthew, one is
That's a
right and
shame.
left, Matthew's right and left, and Luke is one in the other cheek.
Oh,
But I think the context is the bigger thing.
Go on.
You've heard what was said, eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person.
okay.
So it's almost like you led us there. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn him the other also. And if someone wants to sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. If someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you.
Okay. I still see that what I said works, but go on.
Well, it is about turning the other cheek. It's not about sort of the symbolism of where you get slapped, and kind of like that wouldn't make sense from the context to me, because it is about actually breaking resistance by conforming to what's being asked in a way that's not expected.
But
by
is
not
it
pushing back, by not resisting.
Is it conforming to what's being asked in a way that does subtly undermine it, though? That's kind of...
Absolutely.
I think it does. I think that's the case, yeah. But not in that sort of cultural sense. Sorry, Andy.
Yeah, no. Yeah, the interesting thing is, if someone's going to sue you, just give them more than what they're asking for. Sounds like completely passive resistance. Although I could imagine it might make them feel a bit funny. But turning the other cheek feels a little defiant. Like it doesn't say like get down on your knees. You know, if you offer your cheek to someone to hit you again, there's certainly a level of defiance in that, or at least undefeatedness. You do that from on your feet.
Yeah, and however they've hit you, if you then say, right, okay, go on, you've hit me once, hit me again, I think, I stand by it. It's too nice a picture to lose.
I think the story I heard was that it's like offering them to hit you with like their dirty hand.
Okay, or to hit them.
Yeah, that's what I like. That's what I understood. Like the whole point is that you turn them the cheek that they would never slap you on, but that's not really what's meant. It's like
just offer them to carry on, essentially, which is it is defiant, and it does expose what's happening.
And if someone asks you to carry a cloak 1 mile, then that's it. What's the line?
If someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of quite annoying as well, isn't it? You might not want them tagging along for a second mile. You might just kind of, you might be done with needing anyone to carry anything by that point.
I mean, in the Luke version of this has even some, and it's titled "Love Your Enemies," and here it's actually the phrase as well. And has some more stingers. So, but I tell you who hear me, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. If someone strikes you on one cheek, turn to him the other also. If someone takes your cloak, do not stop him from taking your tunic. If clearly the opposite of what fabric you give up first, but never mind. Give to everyone who asks you, and if anyone takes what belongs to you, do not demand it back. Do to others as you would have them do to you. So, if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. So, I mean, I guess this is why Christianity has often been accused of being complacent, and some of the most pious movements have actually been politically duds, in the sense that they weren't political. Even the Methodists were very unpolitical, actually.
And now you do what they tell you.
So that going the extra mile thing strikes a memory for me, which is that at one point in my life I was doing a reasonable amount of hitchhiking. So I got a lift with a lot of people, and there are maybe 3 or 4 people in that time that I still remember very vividly the experience, because they went completely out of their way to take me somewhere that was good to get the next lift. Or one person shared their lunch with me, and taught me how to appreciate French sausages. That's not a metaphor. And those experiences stick with me massively. Now, obviously, that's not a situation where I was forcing them to take me a mile. You know, they'd volunteered in the first place. But them taking me of that extra mile, it was a profoundly moving experience of human connection, which I think can also happen in that kind of oppression type situation. I could imagine someone doing the extra for someone who's making them do stuff, and that being a profoundly affecting incident.
You gotta bear in mind who's the one who asks you to go the mile in the system. It's the Romans, right? Like, you there, carry this, and then suddenly you're marching along the occupants, and then you don't slam down the bundle at the next milestone defiantly and walk away, but you say, "Oh, would you like me to carry this further?" And all of a sudden you're like the brown noser to all of your friends that just doesn't oppose the system.
Yeah, or you're expecting to affect the Roman soldier who most of your friends probably don't think of as human.
Well, or you're simply saying, well, Jesus told me how to do this, and then other Jews are quite rightly asking, what kind of religion is this? You said he was the one who was going to deliver us, and all he does is to tell us to kiss up to those who oppress us.
Yeah, it's really interesting that the phrase "do not resist them" is there in that translation you read.
Yeah,
and you've got the bit about the debate about paying taxes, and Jesus saying, "Well, yeah, who's on the coin? Give it to Caesar." I guess there's an argument that he was trying to make a slightly separate point there, but he still said, pay your taxes, do what's asked of you.
Well, and then the whole Romans 13 bit as well that we talked about briefly before, or maybe in our warm-up. Submit yourself to the governing authorities. God has established these authorities. If you're rebelling against authority, you're rebelling against what God has instituted. And now put yourself in like Bonhoeffer's position or something. When it gets really, really drastic, just what do you do with this? Like, what kind of resistance? There's just way too much in the Bible. If we're just like unpacking the problems here, that doesn't really conform to anything that we expect about resistance.
Jörg, when you said put yourself in whose position?
Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
Can you tell us a bit?
Well, he was a German theologian who was killed by the Nazis in the end because he was part of the plot to kill Hitler. And he allegedly, or he did say he did right. If a drunk person is driving a car, it's not enough to bandage the wounded from that terrible act. You have to actually stop the car. You have to stop the wheel. He doesn't say you have to kill the drunk person, but basically that's what he meant. And being part of this assassination attempt, and there's other writings of him where he wrestles with this, has led to a huge debate within the church. Like, when is it okay to invoke this sort of ethical paradigm of Bonhoeffer? When is it not okay? And who's allowed to invoke it? Like, the most perverse example of Bonhoeffer being invoked that I've come across in my own research is German Lutherans telling Ethiopians that that's what they must do when they were being oppressed by their own system. West German theologians were saying, but basically they were speaking up against the government. The church was saying, this puts us in a bad position. We're already under oppression. Church has already been closed. People are in prison. Can you please stop? And they said, no, we learned our lesson from Bonhoeffer. Which is like, wow, double whammy in so many ways. But that's exactly where it...
Yeah, that's the problem with an example from Hitler, though, isn't it? He provides the grounds for everything and nothing, because in a way he was so so.
Yeah, but is he?
Well, but there's both, isn't it?
Is he so exceptional?
But that's
like,
it. We
you know,
we say that he's so exceptional, so he proves nothing, or we struggle. Really, I think.
Exactly. How, there's a degree, to Idi Amin, to Pol Pot, to Stalin, to like, how do you, and then where do you draw the line? So was Bonhoeffer right or Bonhoeffer wrong? And now German ethicists are saying, well, what Bonhoeffer really what Bonhoeffer really meant was to stop the car non-violently. Like, that's really not what he said. So, or in normal circumstances, well, it's so
normal?
easy to justify anything as not being normal.
So we got into this discussion because we were asking were there examples of resistance in the Bible, and is Jesus an example of resisting?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I mean, if we go back to that, I think, other than my poor attempt to make a story say something, maybe it doesn't. But Jörg is right in a lot of ways that it's not a big leap for British monarchs to come up with the divine right of kings from the Bible and use it to keep people in order for hundreds of years. It's not a tricky extrapolation, is it, to take some of those passages that we've just read and others and say, well, God has put kings in charge and rulers in charge, and God decides when they get moved on, and it's not for us to.
But is that what
resist.
you take?
No.
So what do you take and how?
It's hard to start unpicking that, isn't it? But go on, help me out, Jörg.
I would. Sorry, I'm jumping in for
You're going the same way. So.
Slam it down. But I think it is right, because Jesus did not attack the political systems. Who did Jesus resist? He resisted the Pharisees. He says, resist evil. But when confronted with the Romans, he evades. When he's in front of Pilate, are you putting up a political rebellion is essentially the question. Are you the king of the Jews? And what does Jesus say? He doesn't say anything like, oh, my kingdom's not of this world, or there's a different liberation. Well, he's just, as you say, he doesn't even engage with Pilate.
So, but he did resist the religious authorities, who were certainly powerful.
Yeah, well,
they very directly.
They were under political
criticism.
Yeah, he did. He did resist the religious authorities. But more than the religious authorities, he resisted the Pharisees, who were not necessarily religious authorities. Pharisees were the rebels. They were the ones who were sort of lower class, well-educated, wanted to build a sort of outsider Jewish society and resist the Romans. And it's those guys he resisted by saying, well, your rules are just enslaving people. You're no better. So he resisted, like, in our understanding of, like, if we want to make Jesus sort of a political transformative figure, he wasn't. He resisted another kind of system.
But maybe the important thing is that he was showing up the resistors for who they were. I mean, the same with the Zealots, the same with Peter's attempt to cut off the Roman guard's ear. He was making it very clear that his resistance was different to the kind of resistance that was being encouraged in his day.
Yeah,
which is
and he did certainly resist the evil of taxation, in the sense that was a very exploitative system. But he didn't resist the system as such. Like, you think about the story of Zacchaeus, it is about Zacchaeus turning around, or the tax collector who comes to Jesus and who's considered the sinner, this outsider, this collaborator. And Jesus does not reprimand him for being part of the Roman taxation system, but for being greedy, or actually doesn't reprimand him at all. Zacchaeus wants to turn around, and Jesus receives him with open arms and is happy that Zacchaeus is changing his life and tells him to give back the money he stole. So he is about what happens. Sounds very old-fashioned. Zacchaeus' heart. He's about what happens to the person, and not about the systems. And that's really strange, because actually it's that kind of action by Jesus that has changed systems all over again, but from a very different place, what we normally identify as resistance, attacking the ruler.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to be a one-trick pony again and talk about the Jesus standing next to the woman caught in adultery. I want to use that as my paradigm for resistance against oppression. Does that work?
Mm-hmm. Go on.
Yeah, go on.
And he prevented a violent mob from killing someone by physically being with her. That was cool.
Yeah.
and by showing them what was in their hearts. So a little bit like Jörg was saying, he was pointing up the problems that those who would call themselves the sort of ones who were sorting, those people saw themselves as sorting out a problem in the same way that the Pharisees saw themselves as fixing what was wrong in the religious system of the day. And
and again, he's not resisting the system. He doesn't make the obvious gender argument, like it takes two to commit adultery. Where's the guy? Like, he doesn't attack the way the woman's being treated. He's saying, what about you guys who were just going to throw a stone?
Well, I think he is attacking a lot more than... I think he's attacking those things.
But why isn't he saying it?
I feel like there's a lot of things he didn't say because we weren't ready for it.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I'm putting words in his mouth.
No, it's interesting. I'm just trying to push it because, I mean, the more I look... So here's what I looked up. Where does resistance even come up in the New Testament? And it's usually with regard to sin, resist evil, resist the devil. If you think about Jesus' temptation, that's a story where he resists, get behind me, Satan. Well, that he says to Peter later on, but in that story, he resists the devil. In James 4, verse 7, resist evil and it will flee from you. I think 1 Peter, a similar passage. So resistance is somehow always reserved for the devil rather than systems or politics. I mean, I agree, like Jesus speaks out against Pharisees, he speaks out against certain people, but it's never really a political speech. It's never really what we would normally consider resisting the system.
But how much of that is context, in that we live in a world where you can write a letter to your MP, you can go on a march, you can resist in lots of ways that might be inconvenient but aren't going to get you thrown to the gladiators or whatever. Whereas in the context that Jesus was living and the early church, they would surely have, that would have been it. They would just have been in prison or killed, or they didn't have the opportunities for resistance that we have unless they were actually prepared to pay the ultimate price.
But Jesus was. He did. And he threw away that opportunity. Like, if you want to read him politically, right, you say, okay, you know you're going to go to your death. Are you not now going to stand up and talk about the New Jerusalem coming, about the different kind of society, about freedom from oppression? That Jesus doesn't do any of this.
Well, he launched his ministry talking about freeing slaves, right? And prisoners. By quoting from Isaiah in the synagogue.
Yeah. He talks about the day of the Lord, the day of the atonement, the day in which, after 49 years, everything goes back to start.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, today is that day.
Today is that day, yes.
So we haven't talked about the prophets. So there are quite a few of the prophets put their lives in danger speaking politically against powerful people.
Mm-hmm.
Like condemning kings for their behaviour.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes like whole state level behaviour, and sometimes individual morality.
Yeah, that's an example of did we cover that more last week? Was that more speaking out than actually resisting?
Maybe.
I just don't think that the structures were around in biblical times that could enable you to resist in some of the ways that we're talking about today.
What kind of ways do you mean?
Well, what form would... Okay, put it this way. What form would their resistance have taken? What would you do if you're I say a Roman citizen, but a lot of the early church members probably weren't even Roman citizens. If you are a person living in the early church and you were unhappy with the status quo, what would you actually do that looked like resistance?
Well, there's a lot of things you can do always. You could be passively non-cooperating. So if a soldier forces you to go a mile, you just run away. He's not going to send his contingent after you. Or you can actually build a resistance movement. There's plenty of examples of uprisings in Judea or the whole Roman Empire. And they're quoted in the scriptures as well. You know, sort of the zealots that Andy already mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that involves violence, so doesn't it? So the ways of resisting are pretty much...
Well, you can go to the desert with the Essenes and kind of live a monastic life, get baptized, read scrolls all day. You could just not bother with the Romans and do your bid and cheat on your taxes.
Yeah, now Jesus would seem to say that definitely wasn't what we ought to be doing from the examples that you're bringing up. So you can't do the shirking kind of things and you can't do the violent sort of things. So you're left with being a good neighbour.
And a good citizen and a... Wow, this is turning in a very smooth direction. I'm not...
So I don't think we should dismiss violence yet. I think we should talk about it a bit more.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So some of the people that that we hold as heroic people in the history of resistance of oppressive regimes, definitely some of them, like Gandhi, talked about non-violence, but Gandhi's resistance involved putting himself and lots of other people in a violent situation. And there are also plenty of people who do resist systems using violence or using physical means, even as something as simple as suffragettes breaking the law and chaining themselves to things, disrupting public events. But lots of rule breaking and physically being in places you aren't allowed to be, and maybe destruction of property. So even the non-violent examples that we use, they're not that non-violent feeling when you're stood there and a policeman is trying to remove you from a railing, right? Pretty violent.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think we should dismiss violence quite so quickly.
Well, we can't dismiss violence because it happens all the time. It's just the question is where is the place for violence in sort of a Christian idea of resistance? And we've already mentioned this. Jesus tells his own disciples to put their swords away. For all who draw the sword will die by the sword. He even complains to the soldiers that they come armed. It's like, am I some sort of criminal that you had to chase me like this? Have I ever been resisting in a way, right? So he's clearly angling for something else, yet something much more powerful that has inspired a lot of the so-called non-violent resistance movements. And I think that's the story of Jesus that I would hold on to when it comes to resistance, in the way that he resisted evil by enduring it. And that connects back to what we were saying about the Sermon on the Mount earlier, about the, being slapped on the other cheek or going the extra mile, is that very clearly the template that Jesus had in mind is the only way to resist evil is by enduring it and showing that God is greater, love back, love your enemies. That's the revolution. That's the kind of resistance that he has in mind.
But does that lead to, say, the bus boycotts or something? Is there a line there between enduring and then those creative ways that people like Martin Luther King and Gandhi then kind of did they take that to another level, or were they just on an entirely different kind of idea?
Think Jesus disrupted. He didn't resist, but he disrupted, and that's what brought him into the crosshairs of the state. Mm-hmm. And here too, I would think there is a non-violence. There's a parallel to the non-violence movements in that they were strategic about it, and to some extent, you could say the same about Jesus as well. He's clearly strategic about where he goes. Mm. The Bible tells us this all the time, that he works in one area and says, "Now we need to go away from here," or "I'm now being called to Jerusalem." So he takes his show, in the American terminology, on the road, and he takes it all the way to Jerusalem to put himself into the crosshairs. And that's the thing that's important to me. He has a different idea in mind of why he's doing this from what standard political resistance would look like. So visibility, disruption, speaking out, I think is certainly in his mind, and calling out injustice where he sees it. But that's a different kind of resistance than what we normally think about when we think, okay, here's the system, here's what I want to stop, here's how I attack it. That wasn't Jesus' way. He called out the system, he disrupted the system, but he waited for the system to attack him, to turn its evil force on him, so he could resist it by enduring it, or overcome it by enduring it.
Which is a very hard line for somebody who's living under a repressive regime to attempt to follow, isn't it? Because
under any regime, it would demand of us giving up some things and some certainties, or making some uncomfortable choices about what to disrupt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this idea of making visible is really important, I think. Like, I don't think Jesus just allowed bad things to happen to him, and that did the trick. I think he also made things visible, like you've said a number of times, Jörg. I'm just thinking of the person standing in front of a tank. That is such an iconic image. That's such a powerful image of what's really going on, that's been made visible by the courage of that person.
And how does that image work? It exposes the brute nature of power. Yeah. Here's this sort of fragile human being standing in front of somebody who doesn't even show his face, who's armored in metal. Or there's another from the Arab Spring. There was this beautiful picture of this young lady, I think in Egypt it was. She was nicely dressed and so, and there's like heavily armored policemen in front of her, and she was just staring him down. And it's that kind of making visible that's so cool, and it's so much more effective than if she had been raising a knife or something, because then you would have had to pick sides. But in this case, it was very clear there was no way you could be on the side of the soldier. Or same with the tank. It's very hard to do that when the person standing in front of the tank is not holding a tank crusher.
Yeah, and the same with the civil rights movement. In the States, there was a lot of just being places that they weren't meant to be, and just sitting there and showing up the fact that how ridiculous it was that you couldn't ride in the front of a bus, or
or couldn't make your own salt, or
in India, or whatever.
Yeah.
So
I'm struck by how many of those people put themselves in the line of in the way of violent behaviour. So that's why I think like dismissing violence is missing the picture, because a lot of the people who remember showed a lot of physical courage, which is, the same kind of courage you need to have to go into a situation and be violent. It's not the same behaviour.
No. And we remember the people who stood in front of the tank and the tank stopped, but we don't remember the people who lose their lives that way very often.
Well, sometimes we do. They also become powerful symbols of the oppression endured, don't they?
Yeah, sometimes, but quite often. I mean, countless people have died in the last 5 years in the Amazon, standing up for indigenous rights to various patches of forest, and I forget what the death toll is, but it's in the hundreds. And that doesn't.
Well, the same. I mean, you could argue the same with Tiananmen Square.
Yeah.
The iconic picture is of the person standing in front of the tank, but like, I don't know, he gets rolled over. The next day, the demonstration gets completely bulldozed by the Chinese army. Just to come back to the point of violence, I agree with you, Andy. We should not dismiss violence, but violence isn't part of our strategy. It's exposing violence. That is the Christian way to resist violence, exposing the structures of violence and not conforming to it.
So I can hear the voice of a listener in my head saying, you've only talked about Jesus and you haven't talked about all of the people that God commands nations to kill in the Old Testament.
Oh dear. Yes.
Allegedly, God tells people to kill lots of people in the Old Testament. I'm not sure that I buy that that's actually what's going on. But are we really wanting to go down that?
Very tricky exegete to say that that's not really what the Bible pages are trying to tell you. I think that's a conversation for another time, though.
That's a bit of a rabbit hole.
Because, I mean, it comes back to, who are we as Christians? Who do we read our lives through? And I think, and I know that a lot of people will say, well, not one iota will pass of the law and so on, but that's not part of the law. There's kind of commandments to completely exterminate everybody who lives in the country, including animals and everything.
No, but we do sometimes define ourselves in terms of David and Goliath, for example.
Yes.
What was
It's tricky. I think Jesus, the cross stands between us and the Old Testament in that regard. I don't know. That's why I find it very hard to theologically support warfare. From a pragmatic point of view and many other things, I understand it, but I get very uncomfortable when the church celebrates heroes of war.
Yeah.
And Remembrance Day for me is always the biggest challenge, and I would love to be able to sit in church because it is such an important symbol that somebody from Germany and somebody from the UK can sit together in Remembrance Day, but we bring our flags and plant it in front of the cross. We don't lay them in front of a cross. We do remember the violence, but there's a very different undertone as well of heroism. It's not a tragic thing; it's a story of overcoming. And there's just no good theology of Remembrance Day that really calls out warfare for what it is.
We forget that warfare is at best the absolute last resort when nothing else will work, and that's it at its best. But by Remembrance Day, we appear to have forgotten that, and we talk about it as the only response in that was possible in that situation, and the right response, and we mythologize it from there, I think.
Yeah, and I don't know. I'm even uncomfortable saying that warfare is theologically justified as a last response. Again, I understand why, from a human point of view, that is a very important argument to make. That's why I probably don't have any purely Christian society, but the example of Jesus and the early disciples is that they just endured. They didn't say we get to this point where violence is justified and we can now, like, that was not their idea of overcoming, because of two things. They thought they were going to a better world anyway. So if God had determined that this was going to be their end, then they would use it to testify to this God and how this God would transcend all of the warfare, all the violence coming your way. And secondly, and that's why I think it's so important that the Bible talks about resisting evil, resisting the devil, they understood warfare to be produced not by a raging conflict of interest that unfortunately cannot be settled in any other way, but by spiritual principles that drive people to do this. So they had a sense in which they were resisting not just this specific war, but they were resisting a kind of way of being, an influence that was not from God. And when I frame it like this, I have absolutely no theological resources left to argue for any war. And that's the biblical story as the New Testament would have it.
Yep. Yeah, I'm with you there. I think all I can think of is a political... I suppose I was speaking politically, that we should come from the Second World War as a place where maybe that was politically the only option left was war. But I agree with you. I would call myself a pacifist. I don't think that... I don't have a theology for fighting back in a violent way. Because one thing I've been thinking about is Revelation and how that was written to... They're pretty sure that the time it was written, it was when the churches were being persecuted, when people were being thrown to the lions, and it was written to churches, really under the thumb of the state, and it was a message of hope in resistance. And what do you see of the Christians in it? They endure and they overcome by the blood of the Lamb. There's no fighting. There's fighting that goes on between beasts and angels and all the rest of it, but the humans in the story just endure. And they overcome by trusting in God, don't they? There's no... I think I'm right. There's no fighting there.
Yeah. And that makes it extremely hard to if you come back to sort of more realistic grounds, that makes it extremely hard to argue for a Christian state, because at some point, I don't necessarily want to live in a country that forgets all about its army like that. But again, we are called to a different kind of idea of justice and a different kind of life. And this is where it really gets difficult. But we could even translate this into our day-to-day lives. How attached are we to our lives, to what's going on now, to what we can risk and what we better shouldn't touch? And, how much more if we weren't so attached? And if we thought about evil as a principle, as almost a kind of being, as sort of a cloud that can absorb anything if it wants to, that would have us wary of any kind of single idea of resistance, always being co-opted, always being taken advantage of. So actually that we're trying to resist a certain kind of being, a certain mode of being, rather than any particular kind of system or political ideology.
And I think one of the principles that we're standing against is violence. And I think one of the truths that we stand for is that violence begets violence. And that if you fight something violently, then you will reap more violence. That's...
Some of those that work forces.
So if what we're fighting is evil, that sounds incredibly abstract. So Leah, would that mean that we did go on a protest or didn't go on a protest? Or what? Or maybe that's a silly example because maybe that's not resistance at all. Because I was re-listening to episode 1 where Jörg was saying that we have these little spaces we're allowed to work within, and I think protesting is probably one of those. But anyway, would it lead us to? Would it lead us to do anything, or would it lead us to just sit in our room feeling bad about evil?
I think just because we focus on the evil that's behind it all, it doesn't mean that okay, let's turn it around. We focus on the evil that's behind things, and we remember that has outworkings in all sorts of different ways. So we might talk about a spirit, an evil spirit, if you like, of greed, of individualism, of racism, of chauvinism. You look at how these themes have recurred through centuries and throughout the world in different guises. Why in this, I think about it logically, why in this day and age do we still have a problem with not treating everyone equally no matter what colour their skin is? I mean, when you think about it logically, it's such a bonkers thing to think that just because somebody looks different to me, that I can make all sorts of decisions about them and treat them in a certain way. That to me points to there being something spiritual behind that. And I've been thinking about that bit in Ephesians where it talks about we battle against principalities and powers, and that maybe in our prayers we should be naming some of those things. And maybe
things like greed and
maybe
and
some of their
racism.
names are racism and chauvinism and greed and
and just to come back to the question of what's then practical, the question isn't should I go to this demo or shouldn't I, but how do I go there? With what attitude? What am I trying to achieve? What kind of forces am I plugging in here? What's happening in my own thinking about the other at this point? And then we can finally get away from this idea that there's some actions that are good, some actions or some ways of resisting that work, other ways of resisting that don't work. But actually there's lots of different ways you can resist, just like you could under Roman oppression. It isn't just about the demo. It could just as well be, I don't know, be good to your neighbor while you're not supposed to see them.
It's always good to use yourself as an example.
Exactly. Use yourself as an example. Like I said, that reward is gone anyway.
May as well use it.
Really use it up now. Just couldn't think of anything better. No, but like it is, and it comes back to what we said earlier too. Is when we talked about speaking out. Looking at this spiritually also means to invest time in thinking about it, praying about it, making sure we hear from God about something so we can have the right thoughts about it, that we don't just get absorbed by the powers that govern a particular situation. What makes somebody walk toward the tank instead of running away like everyone else? There's something that transcends the logics of that situation. And that's when the powerful symbol appears.
So this is very exciting because I think this gives us a framework to think about future discussions. So, for example, next time we're planning to talk about nationalism, and that potentially, I think, fits completely into this discussion. As we possibly have a sense that there's some evil or some principles or movements that are happening that are wrong and against what we think we've learnt about God, and we want to resist them. But by having the sense that what we're fighting is evil rather than certain people or certain organisations or something like that, it helps us understand that we're fighting evil in ourselves as well as in other people, and B, that like having a wider perspective. If you think about Jesus saying, "Don't attack these people who've come to arrest me," the reason he didn't want that is because he had a much wider perspective than just whether he was going to get arrested. He was thinking about the real fight he was fighting. If I can use fighting language.
Yeah.
And I think I'd never thought before about how Jesus called out the Pharisees, who weren't actually the rulers. They were the reformers. They were the resistance, if you like. And that's a really deep challenge, isn't it? That we don't just consider ourselves righteous because we're on the side of the resistance, just because we're engaged in battling the system. That doesn't necessarily put us in the right place. And I think that's really humbling. And also we ought to be praying, Lord, show us the things that are prevalent ways of thinking in our culture that I'm just not challenging yet, that I should be. You know, there are plenty, or to take just one example, there would be plenty of Christians in the apartheid system in South Africa who genuinely thought that it was okay. That there are hundreds of Christians in the deep South in America. You know, it's too easy to just say, "Oh my goodness, how on earth did they not see that they were on the wrong side of history?" But how often do we stop and say, "Okay, Lord, what's the log in my eye before I look at the speck in somebody else's? What are the things that I've never challenged just because they were the way I was brought up thinking that aren't right?"
And you also force yourself to think about sort of the spiritual dimension of this, almost challenging or juxtaposing the spiritual worldly view, because people who would defend apartheid would do so with arguments like it prevents conflict, it keeps people in their place, and it gives us the kind of peace we need to preach the gospel or something like this. I was just reading a biography of this German evangelist, Reinhard Bonke, who died last year, so this big, mass evangelist. I'm not a big fan, but he was actually quite good at calling out apartheid in his day and age, and he talks about these people and what they say. But that's a very worldly argument, because it's sort of utilitarian. It says, like, in order to preach the gospel, let's keep it peaceful. And you don't go to the actual spirit of it. Do I still see you as a person? What kind of witness of the gospel is this if we're divided like this? So we need to, and this is why I think it's so important that the New Testament, when it says resistance, it talks about the devil. It talks about us being in danger of being swallowed up by evil. And that's what, 1 Peter, the devil's prowling around you like a roaring lion, seeking whom of you he can devour. Resist him, standing firm in the faith, because you know that your brothers throughout the world are undergoing the same kind of sufferings. It's really important that we gain this kind of a spiritual perspective on politics.
I think that is really helpful to point out not only this thing about how the evil that we're fighting is also within us, but also that some of the arguments that sound like they're kind of non-violent, peaceful arguments are actually, when you examine them, can be part of the evil as well, in ourselves and in other people. So I'm going to draw us to a close there. I'm going to ask Jörg in a second to read something, but I have one other thought that I wanted to tell you about, which is someone explained to me a while ago the significance of the picture, a picture of Jesus that's described in Revelation, which is that there's a picture, I think, from Daniel, in a vision in Daniel in the Old Testament, of God as a warrior king who is marching back to his city, having slaughtered his enemies and being covered in their blood. And then there's a picture of Jesus in Revelation riding back from battle, having won the victory, and being covered in his own blood, and the total inversion of violence just feels really relevant to this topic of resistance, and the kind of physical courage that we talked about, but also the resistance of evil and the self-sacrifice of that.
Wow. Perfect segue. It's almost like you knew what I was going to read. Excellent. Yeah, so this is from a speech by Martin Luther King called Where Did We Go From Here? And it's a bit long, but I'm going to read the whole bit. So he says, "And so I say to you today that I still stand by nonviolence, and I'm still convinced that it's the most potent weapon available to the Negro in his struggle for justice in this country. And the other thing is, I'm concerned about a better world. I'm concerned about justice. I'm concerned about brotherhood. I'm concerned about truth. And when one is concerned about that, he can never advocate violence. For through violence, you may murder a murderer, but you can't murder murder. Through violence, you may murder a liar, but you can't establish truth. Through violence, you may murder a hater, but you can't murder hate through violence. Darkness cannot put out darkness, only light can do that. And I say to you, I've also decided to stick with love, for I know what love is ultimately the only answer to mankind's problems. And I'm going to talk about it everywhere I go. I know it isn't popular to talk about it in some circles today. And I'm not talking about emotional bosh. When I talk about love, I'm talking about a strong, demanding love. For I've seen too much hate. I've seen too much hate on the faces of sheriffs in the South. I've seen hate on the faces of too many Klansmen and too many white citizen councillors in the South to want to hate myself, because every time I see it, I know that it does something to their faces and their personalities, and I say to myself that hate is too great a burden to bear. I have decided to love. If you are seeking the highest good, I think you can find it through love. And the beautiful thing is that we aren't moving wrong when we do it. Because John was right, God is love. He who hates does not know God, but he who loves has the key that unlocks the door to the meaning of ultimate reality.
Thank you, Jörg. Incredibly challenging words from someone that we discussed earlier on. Was not a perfect person and was perfectly flawed, and that perhaps gives us hope that we as fatally flawed people can also pick up some of these ideas. Thanks very much. See you next time. You've been listening to Justice Warriors. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and you can also follow us on social media by searching for Justice Warriors, where warrior is spelt like someone who worries about things. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a rating, since that helps other people find us. Also, please tell your friends about us in real life. We'd love to hear from you. To get in touch, use the email address in the show notes or contact us via the social media links. Thanks for listening.
Told you, and now you do what they told you.